Rohingya refugees say that the conditions they face in Bangladesh are worse than the human rights violations that they experienced in Myanmar. According to a report by the Youth Congress Rohingya, Bangladesh has implemented a growing web of restrictions on Rohingya living in those camps, undermining their rights. A team of researchers conducted more than 240 surveys and around 50 interviews with Rohingya refugees living in 30 different camps in Bangladesh. Police officers working in the camps were also interviewed about conditions. The report found that Bangladesh was initially welcoming of the more than 700,000 refugees that fled a brutal military crackdown in Myanmar back in 2017. But since then, authorities have imposed severe curbs on movement, the ability to work, access education, or participate in religious and cultural practices. Bangladesh officials have forbidden Rohingya from leaving those camps and regularly prevent them from moving within the camps. The government has surrounded refugee camps with barbed wire and fences and constructed checkpoints at entrances. Those who attempt to move around often experience violence, harassment, extortion, and detention. Researchers say some refugees have become so desperate that they have been contemplating suicide. For more on the conditions the refugees face, Hayley Ritsema, International Research Advisor at Youth Congress Rohingya. She joins us live now from Freetown, that's in Sierra Leone. Ms. Ritsema, thank you for joining us. Your organisation has placed some of the blame of those conditions that we've just outlined there on the Armed Police Battalion. That's the force primarily responsible for security at Cox's Bazar area camps. It appears a very coercive environment. Why are conditions deteriorating so badly?
Hi, Dawn. Yeah, thanks for having me on. And that's a great question. As you said, what we found is that initially the response was very welcoming to Rohingya. And in the past few years, there has been brutal crackdowns on their ability to move, their ability to access education and employment, and all those sorts of things that are really fundamental to fulfilling human life. And yes, from our research, we found the Armed Police Battalion were a main source of the oppression that Rohingya are experiencing because they perpetrate violence and extortion regularly against Rohingya to enforce these restrictions against movement. Many citing that unless they could afford to pay bribes, they would not get justice for any crimes committed against them. They would not be able to leave the camps. They would not be allowed to bring in needed goods and food into the camp from outside. Essentially, the Armed Police Battalion is controlling all their movements, and unless they can afford the bribes, they are stuck with only humanitarian aid to survive. And unfortunately, the humanitarian aid is not enough, leaving them in a very dire situation.
Ms. Ritsema, you described their difficult conditions and the extortion that is being experienced. The report conducted numerous interviews. You even interviewed the police. How widespread is that extortion, though? Is that clear from the report?
Yeah, so what we did is we conducted both qualitative interviews and quantitative surveys so that we could actually have some hard numbers to describe what's going on. And of the 241 surveys that we did, we found 98% reported extortion and corruption among authorities.
Okay, a startling figure there. Ms. Ritsema, there were recommendations as well that came out of all of this, 39 in all. And those recommendations are for the Bangladesh government, for the international community as well, for humanitarian organizations and some of those who have already been giving aid. But among those priorities, what's the top priority for you now? What has to happen first in order to ease the situation that you've described?
Yeah, of course. The top priority for me and for YCR is that these restrictions on movement are lifted because they really are the source of much of the oppression that they're experiencing. It's keeping them from accessing their basic needs. It's having severe impacts on their mental and physical health. It's keeping them from education and employment. And if these restrictions are lifted and they're allowed to actually integrate more fully into Bangladeshi society, we think that this will have drastic improvements on their situation.
A lot has to happen before we can get that progress that you've described. I think you may agree with me, Ms. Ritsema, but the aid that's coming in is important too. And we've just heard recently at the UN General Assembly that more aid has been pledged to the tune of about $116 million from the United States. That's supposed to go towards supporting the refugees. But you want the international community to do more than just pledge that financial aid. And you've also said that the Bangladesh government officials need to be held accountable for the abuses that you've described. Do you hold out hope, though, that that's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think any time that you're in work like this, where you're trying to make the world a better place, you have to have hope that these things can happen, while still recognizing they will be very difficult. And to acknowledge your point about there is going to be an increase of aid coming, I just want to say that's still not enough. Last year, there was a funding gap of 330 million USD to the Rohingya situation. And so that also is contributing to their plight, is that although these humanitarian agencies are working very hard to improve the situation and meet Rohingyas' needs, they are simply unable to because they don't have the funding to do so. However, on the other side of that, the Bangladesh government is using this idea that the Rohingya are receiving humanitarian aid, and so that's why they don't need to leave the camps, when that's not true. Receiving aid, whether it's enough aid or not, is not a legitimate reason to restrict someone's right to move. And in fact, Bangladesh is a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which entitles everyone within their borders to the right to freedom of movement. And so regardless of whether or not the Rohingya are getting enough humanitarian aid, which is another conversation entirely, it does not legitimize Bangladesh's restrictions that they've imposed on them.
A lot more progress still needed to improve their living conditions there in the camps. Thank you very much, Ms. Ritsema. We've been speaking there to Hayley Ritsema, International Research Advisor at Youth Congress Rohingya.